morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world that you are joining us today, whichever time zone you are on. I am so pleased to welcome you to this virtual Speakers Corner showcase on mental health. I'm Anna Mathur. I'm your host today. I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a Times bestselling author, and I'm a host of the podcast, The Therapy Edit. I'm really passionate about taking therapy out of the therapy room. And that is exactly what we are doing here today in our virtual showcase. This is our way of checking in with you, our clients and friends. We want to encourage conversations and offer you some thoughts and some tools to support our mental and emotional well-being. And this is as we process the impacts of the last few years, but also as we look ahead to life post-pandemic. Our society is changing really quickly. And clinically, I have seen such a stark increase in people experiencing loneliness and isolation. And I know that many of us here have felt the impact of the pandemic. And that's in so many different ways. And it's also challenged our confidence in our daily routines. And it's caused many of us, understandably, to reassess all that is important to us. Many of us have had far less access to those that we love in recent years. You might have gone through grief, trauma, many different kinds of stresses that people have journeyed through over the last couple of years. We have not, and we will not feel and be the same. Now, technology has just been a huge blessing. If we remember those times, those Zooms, those house party moments of just coming together with people, but also all of those times that we have had to move meetings online and develop those connections and relationships online. So it has been a huge blessing in enabling us to connect without having to travel. We think about how that has transferred to kind of the medical world with doctors and patients, and then the education, with students and lecturers. But there is a flip side to so many of these coins. The convenience and the cost benefits of doing these things digitally are forcing more and more activities online. Now, this is great in so many ways, but we are still hardwired as humans. We are hardwired for connection. We need to be in the presence of each other. So there has been so much less of that happening. I often say that digital connection is always better than no connection. But I liken it to eating fast food when really your body is craving something really nourishing. It hits the spot, but it doesn't nourish us in the same way. Now, our workplaces are also changing really fast, aren't they? With many adapting to home and hybrid working. We need to both embrace change, but also whilst continuing to build and maintain those meaningful connections with our colleagues and our clients. Something I always say to my clients and the people that I work with is the reason it feels hard so often is because it is hard. It has been hard. We are not strong enough. We are not failing. We are humans having a response to what has been a really unusual situation, and we're all just trying to navigate through that in all the different ways that it has manifested in our lives. But there is hope. There is so much hope, and we are going to be bringing you some fresh insight into that today. We have got an exceptional lineup of speakers for you, all who have got the most compelling mental health stories and tools to share with you, tangible tools to share with you. Over the course of the next 60 minutes, we will welcome psychotherapist and mental health coach, Petra Velzeboer. We will also hear from journalist, producer, and mental health consultant, Hearn, and also author, broadcaster, journalist, and strategist, Alastair Campbell. Now, if you have any questions at all during our speakers' sessions, please just pop them in the Q&A tab down at the bottom of the screen, and then towards the end of the session, we will have a Q&A panel where we'll answer as many of these as possible. So our first speaker, Petra Velzeboer. She is the CEO of Thriving Mental Health Consultancy, PVL. She founded her company out of this acute frustration with a well-being industry that talked a really good game, but was often toxic on the inside. Her experience of a poisonous cult influences her ability to access these toxic workplaces. She teaches how practicing courage and vulnerability can actually enhance productivity, fulfillment, and happiness. So it's great to have you with us, Petra. It's over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that wonderful introduction, not only to myself, but to the topic of mental health. And so good to see so many of you joining us today to discuss this really important topic. As Anna said, I run a business all about mental health in the workplace. And I think there have been so many challenges when it comes to connection, isolation, and a whole host of things. But really, I want to today think about what is the opportunity that this time has created. How can we think about the workplace and how we go about our daily lives in a radically different way? So I'm just going to share a couple of slides. I've got 10 minutes and I want to highlight a few key ideas. And as Anna said, open to questions towards the end of today. So my question to kick us off during this session is, what if work was good for your mental health rather than something you felt you needed to recover from? And so many times I go into businesses and we're still crisis managing. We're still thinking when it comes to mental health in the workplace, how do we prevent the bad things from happening or the difficult times that people experience? And perhaps focusing on depression, anxiety, the things that are prevalent. But what we sometimes do is we then switch around the stigma of mental health and only think that it means mental illness. Now, many of you may be familiar with our mental health continuum, or just really capturing how mental health is not only that crisis or struggling end, which many of us on this panel have been through, and I'm sure many of you have been through, but really it's also about thriving and excelling. So how can we dial up our environments and the factors that will enable us to thrive and excel, yes, even in a pandemic, post-pandemic world? There are things that we can do, that we can take into our control. And of course, there are some that we can't. Now, when I do a little poll with people in businesses, so many people are still in survival mode, perhaps feeling that absence of connection that Anna mentioned. But you'd be surprised, there's quite a number of people who are reporting to be thriving, to be finding the boundaries that they need in order to evolve their workplaces. Now, this is the world of the future. Many training events are focused on, when we think about mental health, how do we spot the signs and symptoms of poor mental health? And I'm all about noticing differences in behavior that people might be going through. But it's worth remembering that people won't always give us a sign. I know in my story, which I won't go into in great depth, but I was raised in a religious cult and descended into alcohol addiction and depression and eventually suicidal ideation myself. But this was the picture that captured when I most wanted to take my own life. I was at a festival and that beaker is filled with probably my fourth or fifth glass of wine. And I was at a festival with my young daughter in my care and completely blacked out in a drunken stupor. Now, I worked really well when I was at my worst to put on my makeup, to show up at life so that people would never ask me, how are you? Because I thought if they asked me, then I might not be able to pull the pieces together or to answer in any way that was useful. So I armored up and pushed people away as much as possible. So I think it's worth us noting that, yes, we may see changes in behavior in some people, but really, why aren't we asking these questions collectively across the board to everyone in our organization, and crucially, opening up ourselves, leading by example when it comes to starting this conversation, which I know the panelists today will be doing a little bit further. Now, when I go into companies, there is still a massive disparity between what physical health looks like and how we talk about it, and what mental health looks like and how we talk about it. Physical health, it is aspirational. It's about winning, it's tough, we get cool outfits, we want to talk about how good we're doing in the gym or what weights we're lifting. But still, when we talk about mental health in so many places, these are the images that come up. We think of people who are broken, we think of disability, we think of sadness and isolation. And while some of these might be the internal feelings and symptoms for people, it isn't always the way that people portray themselves. So I guess I want to leave you with the thought of living in a radically different world and looking at this time as a real opportunity to evolve our workplaces. So finally, what if mental health was aspirational? It was about success and thriving too. What if when we talked about mental health, we completely knew that it was about everyone? What if we saw this time as an opportunity to change the way that we work, including each and every conversation that we have, and we completely had the ability to bring our full selves to work? So my question to leave you with is, what if work could be good for our mental health? And hopefully you can ponder on that and think, if that were possible, what were the small things that I can do each and every day to lead by example in knocking down the stigma of this topic? And yes, part of that is saying, hey, I'm struggling today. And as a CEO and leader who struggles with PTSD, I will often be the one telling my team, hey, today is a tough PTSD day, or I'm not proud of that reaction because my nervous system was on edge. And I'll be the first one to open that conversation. But we'll also create positive accountability in our workplace. And that's going, what's one small thing you can do to invest in yourself today? And then we'll ask each other about it, whether it's sleep, whether it's getting your therapy appointment in, whether it's exercise, whatever it might be, connection. We create that positive accountability within our team. And I think each and every one of us can be responsible for the way the world looks at mental health. That's my time. Thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Petra. I think it's really powerful to reframe how work can actually be really good for our mental health, because I know that feeling of accomplishment that can come with work can be so enlivening, and having that sense of purpose is just really important for kind of general mental well-being. Often I know that it has been true for me in the past that seeming like you have it all together can be a real defense against falling apart. So I think it's amazing that to encourage workplaces to ask twice, to find ways that we can bring our authentic selves into work. And now we have got Laura Hearn. Laura is an astute and talented communicator with 15 years of experience working as a BBC journalist and producer. She has worked with some of the corporation's leading talent, producing often sensitive and highly detailed content. Laura is a passionate and tenacious storyteller, and her personal mental health experiences, combined together with her solutions-oriented mindset, educates, informs, and enables audience to think, act, and feel differently about the world around them. Laura, it's great to have you today with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Really lovely to be here. So thank you all for joining us. I guess a little bit, probably some of you know a little bit about me, and for those who don't, I guess I'm a storyteller at heart. Stories for me are fundamentally what I love sharing. I love telling stories, and I feel that it's probably been my own story has kind of merged my personal story with my professional story. My background is I am a journalist. I was with the BBC for nearly 17 years until last year, when I finally decided to find my own identity outside of the BBC. But stories for me is something that really helped me heal. I guess my background is I had a severe eating disorder. I really struggled to find treatment in this country, both on the NHS and privately. And I was really fortunate and was able to go to the States for 6 months at a cost of my mum selling her house, which is something that I often also try and champion around equality around mental health care. But it undoubtedly saved my life. And that, alongside my time as a journalist at the BBC, was also really critical to my recovery. I was really terrified of losing my job. But it was obviously quite apparent that I was becoming sicker. And the thing that really helped me was my boss at the time. He was just a human. It wasn't any gimmick or any yoga or EAP program that was offered to me. It really was just Simon. He became a bit of a dad to me. And one day I just couldn't really function at work. And he took me into the car park in the old BBC and said, "What's wrong?" And I just burst into tears. And I said, I just can't really be here. And he said, "Laura, it's okay. You just go home and we'll check in tomorrow." And he then allowed me to have 7 months off, kept my job open while I went to the States. And I'm still great friends with him. And if it wasn't for him and just being a human, and he got what I needed because his mum had also suffered from depression. So it wasn't any kind of gimmick that was offered that companies, I think, now feel like they need to hit tick boxes often. It was just really listening to me and making me feel heard, and that there wasn't anything, to be ashamed of. But when I went to the States and I came back, the one thing that was magic about the States was that many of the people who were in the eating disorder unit, the staff, they had recovered themselves. So they shared their story, but it was a story that was evidence that you could get over this and you could go out and live your life. And it wasn't a clinical environment. It was a really homely environment, a nurturing environment. And I kind of really related to that, and it really helped. And so when I came back, I walked into the office, and there's these big spiral staircases at the BBC, which can be quite daunting at the best of times. And no one really knew what to say to me, and I didn't really know what to say back. But all a couple of people did. It was at tea bar, which came over and said to me, "Look, I don't know what to say to you, Laura, but it's really nice to see you here." And that was just huge for me. And it was at the time when a senior editor was suffering from depression, and we worked together on a campaign called Open Up. And it was a campaign that really was about sharing stories and opening up in the company, and to create a sort of a dialogue around mental health. So there was me and 4 other people who shared their stories: depression, OCD, PTSD from being a camera person in Afghanistan. And when it went out on the internet, I was pretty terrified, if I'm honest. I didn't really know, my editors had given me permission to do it, but I didn't really know hugely. But actually, all I got was, when it went live, I got so much great feedback from people who felt that they hadn't been able to share their story, didn't know how to, but actually it was really cathartic, not just for me, because I felt like it was a relief, because it was always the elephant in the room. But so through the rest of my career, I've interviewed thousands of people, vulnerable case studies, and I guess the way I always I felt very grateful that many of them trusted their story with me, but it was always because I shared probably a little bit of my own and I related to them. And I think awareness is great. There's a lot of awareness now, more within companies and within the world around mental health, but there's also many cultures that is not one size fits all. I did a lot of work around different cultures within a company, and I think we often come from a Western approach, but there is no one size fits all. Even in eating disorder or depression or anything, no one looks the same. And so I think having a more bespoke plan for each person would be really, really helpful. And that's what I often try and help when I try and change narratives around, narratives of how do you communicate your own story. Everyone has a story, but the story is fluid. Like, I'm not the same person I guess I was this time last year, or even yesterday. And so I think people, often when I got feedback from what I shared, was that they didn't really want all these gimmicks. One person worked on the news desk, and all she desperately wanted to do was actually just be able to pick her kids up from school, and it was stressing her out so much that she couldn't go and speak to her editor. And I often felt like I was really lucky to have Simon, because many of them, I think, were slightly emotionally constipated. And maybe, so I always use that word because maybe it's not, they didn't know how to ask the question, because that can be quite daunting. People didn't know whether they were going to upset me or trigger me, but also some people, some editors just, I wouldn't have wanted to speak to. So I think, there's a whole educational thing of just, it's not that difficult just to not have a script. You don't always have to know what to say, but just to really just be a human, and just a hug can go a long way. I'm such a hugger. So I think, sharing stories creates a great awareness. It helps others to heal. I think, having a decentralized approach, having more leaders talk about it, but also having, peer support. That was what really helped me as well. When I was in the treatment center, it was having these role models and a peer support community, and having that within, a company is hugely valuable. But I think, at the end of the day, I think ask the employee what they need. Don't assume. And I think many of us can make assumptions about what is really going on in someone's life. And actually, all I really needed was Simon to take me into that car park, give me a hug and say, Laura, it's okay. To just be a human. And all the other the other elements are great, but sometimes, as that woman on the news desk, she went off on gardening leave, and all she really wanted was to know that she could pick her kids up from school 3 times a week. And I think if we just asked more, listened more, and said, look, I don't know, I don't have the words, but I'm here, I think that would be hugely valuable in many companies. So I guess that's probably my time's up. I don't time it or script it, but thank you so much for being here. And next person.
Laura, that is such a powerful story to share. Thank you. And I think you're right. As we share our own stories, it gives people that permission to feel safe in sharing theirs. And I think it was powerful to consider how caring connection in the workplace, where so many of us spend so many hours, can be the most incredible catalyst for personal change, which can then support people who may have otherwise moved away from that workplace to actually thrive within it. And I think what I really got from what you were saying was the importance of allowing people and just opening up those simple conversations, even if they literally begin in the corner of the kitchen with, I don't know what to say. We don't need to pressure ourselves to get it perfectly. We're all just messy in our own humanness, no matter how much we might try and hide elements of that. So I just, before we move on, want to give you a quick reminder just to pop your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom. Now, our final speaker needs no introduction. The author, commentator and journalist Alastair Campbell will be a very familiar face to many of you, if not all of you. Alastair served as a spokesman, a press secretary and director of communications and strategy to Tony Blair during the first 6 years of his power. In more recent years, he has become increasingly involved with mental health charities and causes, speaking really frankly about his own experience of addiction and depression. He is a former Mind Champion of the Year. Alastair is an ambassador for the Time to Change campaign. He co-founded the all-party campaign Equality for Mental Health, which secured an incredible extra £600 million for mental health services. Wow. He was awarded an honorary fellowship of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in recognition for his leadership role in breaking down the stigma surrounding mental illnesses. A huge welcome to you, Alastair.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm actually going to pick up where Petra and Laura have led in a way. And this issue of mental health and mental well-being and mental illness as well, when we get it in the workplace. And I want to tell you a couple of stories that really explain how lucky I've been. My first personal encounter with mental illness that I had to identify as mental illness because I was in hospital was in 1986 when I had a psychotic episode and I was arrested. It's a very, very, very long, complicated story, and I've written a couple of books about it, but I'll just park all the facts in it for now. But take you to a point of about 5 days into my hospitalization, I got a phone call from my former boss at the Daily Mirror. Now, I'd left the Mirror to go to a different newspaper. My former boss, Richard Stott, was absolutely furious with me, basically said, don't darken my door again. And he was one of the first people to phone me up. So this was back in 1986, and they wheel the phone in on a trolley. They plug it into the wall. They give you the phone. At this stage, by the way, I'm completely paranoid. I'm still not, even though they've sedated me, I'm still not in a very good state. And Richard said to me, his very first words were, he always called me old man. Hi there, old man. I hear you've gone mad. And I said, well, I'm not well. I'm in hospital. And he said, well, I'm not going to say I told you so. And I said, well, you kind of just did. He said, yeah, maybe I did. But anyway, I'm going to say something now. And this time you're going to listen to me. You're going to stay in that bed and you're going to stay in that hospital till the doctor says you can leave. You're going to go home. You're going to make sure that you look after Fiona, my partner. She and I have been going through a bit of a bad time because of me going crazy. You're going to rest for as long as they tell you to rest. You're then going to go back to that newspaper I told you never to go to. When you're about 89% feeling right, I want you to come back here and I want you to start at the bottom again and start all over again. And that may sound a bit harsh, but let me tell you, even telling you that story now, I feel this kind of weight lifting off me, because what it said to me was, there's a guy that I'd upset. He'd heard all these stories about me going crazy, getting arrested, all this stuff, but he wasn't defining me by it. And I think the most important thing I say to all employers, never define people by illness. We don't do it with physical illness. We don't say, oh, there's Anna, she's the asthmatic. There's Laura, she's the diabetic. So why do we, by the way, I'm not saying you are, I have no idea. Why do we do it with mental illness? Why do we define people by mental illness? And then the second story that was, I guess, a stroke of luck. Fast forward a few years, and 1994, so not that long, 8 years after I've been hospitalized, Tony Blair asked me to work for him. And I had a lot of doubts. And one of the doubts I had was that I was worried, having cracked up once, that I'd crack up again under pressure. I knew it would be pressure way bigger than anything I'd ever had as a journalist. So I actually said no. And then I went off on holiday, and then he kept nagging me and badgering me, and eventually came down to see me on holiday, and he sort of talked me into it. But before I said yes, I said, listen, there's something you need to know. I know you know that I had a drink problem. I know you know that I get depression. But one of my worries is that I did have this breakdown, and I, back in my mind, I think, well, it's happened once, it could happen again. And I told him all the detail of all the hearing voices, hearing music, of the paranoid delusions that I was having, of seeing things that weren't real and seeing things that were real, but which I couldn't quite manage, and just really giving him a sense that my mind got completely, totally out of control. And he said this, and we mentioned the Time to Change campaign, which sadly this wretched, awful government has decided no longer to fund. But when we first launched the campaign, they used this quote that I once told a magazine of the conversation I had with Tony Blair, and they used it in the first adverts we did on the Tube. And it went like this. I gave him all that stuff about my breakdown, hearing voices, paranoid delusions and all that. And he did look a bit worried, but he said, well, I'm not bothered if you're not bothered. And I said, well, what if I'm bothered? And he said, I'm still not bothered. And again, that was somebody who was, I think most people reckoned by then, probably going to be Prime Minister, but basically not defining me by what I was telling him was an ongoing mental health condition. And I've had many, many bouts of depression. Since then, I've had a few manic episodes, but I've never felt that I've not been able to deal with them. I've got better and better at dealing with them. And the way I've got better at dealing with them is by being open. I don't say to people who have a mental health problem, you should be open. What I do always say is I've never, ever, ever regretted being open. And I'm guessing that both Laura and Petra would probably say the same thing. Most of the people that I meet on the sort of mental health campaign trail, if you can call it that, we all have that sense. I can't deny, I've got a big ego. I quite like it when people say, oh, you do such a great job for mental health. I don't mind that, but I actually get a lot out of it myself. And my final point to employers is this. I did an event recently with the Bank of Ireland. It was during COVID, and it was online, all staff event. And the CEO, she'd been recently appointed CEO, Francesca McDonough, I think her name was. And she opened her presentation with these words: I've asked Alastair to join us today because from this day forward, given all we've learned during the pandemic, the number one strategic priority of this bank is going to be the health and well-being of our staff. And I'd never heard anything like that before. And that's a bank, by the way, that's a bank. And we know what banks are like, and we know what bankers are interested in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting was afterwards, I was then able to say, with her on the call, with 3,000 employees on the call, right, she said that, now it's up to you guys to hold her feet to the fire on it. And the thing I always say to employers is that this isn't just the kind of, let's all be nice to people and let's all love each other and let's all give each other a hug, though I'm with Laura on the hugging. It's actually about saying to companies, your company will be better and stronger if your people are better and stronger. And your people will be better and stronger if you understand that just as they have physical health, they have mental health as well. And some days it's not great. And you have to recognize that. And you have to adapt for that. And they will become better employees, more loyal, more hardworking, if we understand that you're actually taking consideration of what goes on up here for us. And my final point is this: when if I'm interviewing people for a job, and I have two identical CVs, and same O level, same A level, same degree if they've got a degree, same sort of trajectory of career, but one of them has got 6 months that went missing because they got in trouble, or because they had a drink problem that had to be sorted, they were in drug rehab, or because they got into trouble with the police, whatever it might be. If that person's putting that down there and saying that's about an episode of mental health, I'm going to go for that person over that person. And not because I'm a mental health campaigner, because I'm looking at that and thinking that's probably given them more resilience. It's given them honesty, which is why they put it down there rather than hiding it, which is what we used to do in the old days. And the other thing it's given me is a sense that they will only work in a place where actually their mental health and well-being is going to be valued and respected. And that's the only sort of people that I would want working with me as well. So there you go. I think I've just about stayed to my time. And I'll now hand back to you, Anna.
Oh, Alastair, thank you so much for sharing so generously with us, showing how important it is never to define people by their illnesses, because when we put each other in boxes, it can be then a massive weight, an additional pressure to kind of earn our way out of them and find confidence to speak out again and feel comfortable in that setting. And I think, as you were saying, some of the hardest and darkest parts of our journey can actually in time become the most pertinent contributors to who we are in the most incredibly redemptive ways. And I guess when we don't fear the mental health challenges of other people, it invites them to be more open, and it welcomes them to accept the support that is available. And I love, I often say to people that are kind of teetering on the edge of having those conversations, where there is help, there is hope. And when we define people by their mental health challenges, we can unintentionally shut that avenue down. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And also, everybody, thank you so much for sending in your questions and comments via the Q&A function below. I'm just going to nudge my Q&A up here. So we're going to invite the panel back, because we're going to have a little look at the questions that we've got here. I've got some absolutely fantastic ones. Starting with Matthew, he's talking about from the perspective of mental health in the gaming industry. And I think it can be interesting to think of what are some of the positive ways that technology has impacted mental health, perhaps in the workplace, perhaps outside of the workplace over the last couple of years, because I think clinically, working with clients that may not have approached therapy before, may not have felt comfortable and confident enough to kind of step into a clinic room or a practice, it's removed that barrier for them. So I've found that seeing clients that may not have chosen to access that before for whatever reason. So that's one of the positives that I've sensed from the technology, kind of the rise in technological use. So anybody else got a kind of a positive that they would like to share with us?
I can share. Like social media was something that I really needed when I returned from the States, because I felt quite I had a little bubble there, and when I came back I wanted to create a network, or not a network, but some connections. So I built like an art platform where people could share their stories through a creative space. And what I learned was that social media is it's the lens you look at it through. It can either be a really toxic place, and I think a lot of people talk about that, but actually you get to choose and curate your world and the people you connect with. And I really had to navigate that in the platform that I created, in the way I shared stories. But undoubtedly it's helped me to connect with people. Tech has helped me to connect with people from all over the world, not just through mental health, but through my job. And I think it's how we use everything that we're given. It's another tool, but it can also be a tool, that can be detrimental. But we do get a choice to curate how we use the tools, I guess. So I think I've had some really great positive, interactions with it. I did actually take myself off for a little bit because it became a bit much, but that was also my choice. And then when I felt ready, I could engage in it. So yeah, I think it enables us to speak to people who our paths would never normally cross.
It's just making sure that you know when that balance is tipping. I think what Matthew was saying about gaming, and how, for many people, especially young people over the pandemic, and those that are kind of immersed in work and actually just need to kind of shift their focus, that gaming has given focus, where when you're doing something else, you can almost have conversations with less pressure, because you're kind of coming together for a different purpose. So I thought that was really interesting. Anything else on that?
I might just pick up one thing before that you said at the beginning, human connection, and will always champion that first. There is nothing like being able to give someone a hug, and so I think you can merge the two where it's necessary, but without anything, human connection would always be a priority for me.
I can add to it. I've got a completely remote team, some of whom I've never met. And people often ask me, can you build psychological safety, connection, and mentally healthy culture completely remotely? And with the idea that it's just not possible through a screen, and I don't think it's as possible. And while I'm all in the camp of hugs, like Alastair and Laura, my team would report that we have one of the most mentally healthy cultures because we create space for it. So we create space for that time that isn't just about tasks and admin and that sort of thing. And I completely go with Laura's comment. My siblings, my parents live all over the world. So just having that connection point has been really useful. But I do think we need a holistic approach within the workplace, because I have seen some kind of use technology as like, here's this app, here's this thing, go sort yourselves out, without the holistic view of, we need to think about how we have our meetings and how we engage with each other in general. What does that connection look like? Plus the technological support, right? So how can we just create that full picture for people?
I think the other thing I'd throw into that, Anna, is I think companies and organizations which have a good smattering of staff who have been trained in mental health first aid helps to create a culture. Mental health first aid, for a start, is interesting. It's and you can do it fairly quickly. But I noticed that when you go into places that haven't done mental health first aid, and then you go back a year later when you've got, somebody in every department who's been trained in it, it changes the culture. And it does help to break down the barriers. And I know also cases where people have really been able to help, and not just in the workplace. Once you've got that training, you've got it on public places, you've got it on a train, you've got it when you see somebody struggling in the street. And so I think that I'm a big advocate of mental health first aid as a not just because we're going to help people who are struggling, but actually to change the culture of companies and organizations.
One of the questions here is, what's the best thing a company can do to make sure that their employees feel like they can be heard? And I think that sounds like, that sounds like a really good response to that, is make sure that there is someone in each team, in each area of the workplace, that has that insight, that has just at least that awareness of some of the common symptoms, or just to how to start and facilitate those conversations. Any other
and have it, can I just make one, and don't necessarily make it part of human resources. It should not be part of a structure. It should be. I can remember when I was a journalist on the Daily Mirror, and the unions were very strong. We had this system called the chapel. The chapel was like, every department was called a chapel, and you had a mother and father of the chapel, and they were elected. And they could be any level. It was very rarely the boss. It was usually somebody kind of middle or lower ranking, but they were the people that you went to if you had a problem. And I think in terms of mental health first aid, having somebody who's not there for working for human resources, but is there working for their group, it really can have a big cultural effect.
I think I'd really like to make a real point that we're all sitting here, and I'm speaking from a white person's lens, Western, but the cultural differences really need to be bespoke. I shot some film with some Black African women around their body image, and the stories they shared, they just wouldn't have spoken to me. They don't have a doctor that represents what they feel like. So imagine if that's in the workplace, they're not going to go and talk to me, even if we shared a similar experience. And so no matter what your mental health issue is, you need to have someone you can relate to and understands the cultural differences. And I think that has to be implemented.
Yeah, that awareness is so important. Just have those conversations, and maybe even ask people what would be helpful for you. What reason?
Yeah, ask them. Yeah.
Would you like to be able to access? What would be helpful? I've got a specific question here for Petra. Do you think we need to focus on helping mentally healthy people as well as people who are struggling? And how do we make sure that their health is maintained?
Great question. And if we all have mental health just like we have physical health, then yes, of course, because it is about maintenance. It's about how we look after ourselves. We're seeing a big rise in burnout, and that's really the cumulative effect of stress over time and how that's affecting people. And if they've got a predisposition for depression, anxiety, those symptoms may come out. But we also forget that somebody with a diagnosis can be thriving or in the excelling camp, to use that mental health continuum, because they've got the therapy or the exercise or the meds or whatever it might be that supports them holistically. It isn't just somebody who's mentally ill is always in this struggling camp, right? So it moves up and down depending on those personal stresses, the workplace stresses, whatever's going on, our resilience levels, a whole combination of things. And so I think normalizing conversations about mental health in general allows somebody who's struggling, who might be a bit hesitant, to go, oh, that person's comfortable with it, or they've been through something before. That's the person I'm more likely to go to than anyone else, right? So I think there's something just about leading by example. Maintaining good mental health is just as important as focusing on when we're struggling, because that's a preventative perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just would say I want to talk a lot about trying to change the lens through which we look at this whole thing. When Time to Change started, we had this thing about 1 in 4 of us will have a mental health problem at some point, and I've tried to persuade them to move to 1 in 1. 1 in 1 of us has mental health, and focus less on the problem. I mean, the problems will all have the problems possibly at some point, but actually, we think about how do we look after our mental health, then we get into that preventative mindset, which means that fewer of us will become mentally ill. And if only we had a government who thought like that, and if we only had more companies who thought like that, we could change this thing actually, I think, quite quickly, and frankly end up saving an awful lot of money. Because once you do get mentally ill, and once you get the treatment that you may then need, it tends to be in crisis. I only got help when I had a psychotic breakdown and was arrested. Up until then, now, to be fair to everybody around me, I probably wouldn't have taken the help even if it had been offered. But for an awful lot of people, I think you can, if you can get them help. And then if I do a lot of work in Pentonville Prison with the mental health team there, and anybody who's ever been inside a prison, you basically, you get some really bad people in there, okay, and they should do really bad things and they should be locked up. You get an awful lot of people in there who frankly should have been in psychiatric care at some point in the past, and if they had been, maybe they wouldn't be where they are now, where they're not going to get better. So I think that preventative approach is I'm totally with Petra on this. We've got to completely change the lens.
I think this takes us really well into the next question, as we unveil mental health challenges more in the workplace. How are companies actually going to be able to manage the resources needed to provide people with that support? And because there can be limited external resources. And I think, following on from what you were saying, is actually, if this needs to be a priority, and it needs to be almost something that is embedded in the culture of a workplace, of how we're making time for these things. Where are we putting the boundaries? Where are we placing the expectation on employees to be responding to emails at certain times? And is that being modeled by management? How, if people are just kind of working all hours, and I think this has been the challenge through the pandemic, where those boundaries have just become even more blurred because of the juggle going on behind the scenes, where everything kind of just bled into each other. And it's almost like I sense that there needs to be a kind of a reconfiguring of those expectations and those boundaries, and that needs to be coming from the top. But any other thoughts on how the workplace and how companies can manage this, and how there are limited resources, there are months of waiting lists? And
I think we probably all have something to say on this one. I love your approach to it. I think people think they need all the bells and whistles and the in-house therapist and the yoga sessions and like every single benefit in order for people to invest in their mental health. And that's all lovely. If you have those resources, great. But EAPs are traditionally used 4 to 6% of the employee base uses them. They're often more in crisis when they're calling a helpline number. The way they're branded and the messaging isn't always useful for preventative cultures. But also the biggest benefit is, to Laura's story, is about allowing people to be human in the workplace, to have empathy, to create space for connection, to be honest about what they're going through. And a lot of maintenance is about taking personal responsibility individually and the organization taking responsibility. And that's about creating psychological safety, talking about how we work, not just what we do. So to your point about evolving our working practices, but it is completely free to talk to your team openly about how they're coping with their lives and their work, right? So yes, we like policies and other things, but I think people forget that sometimes it's simpler than we actually make it.
Yeah. I mean, I used to have like a yearly appraisal to talk about my work development, but like, why is it once a year? And why was I not having not a mental health.
How are you doing?
Yeah. And appraisal, like a check-in, like much more frequently around how I'm just living or coping, or because my home life was not exclusive to my professional life, and it's not vice versa. I think it's just a lot simpler than I think it can be, and I think companies it's a priority. They have to invest in it, because long term it's financially way more beneficial and productive to invest in it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think the good ones are doing it. Interestingly, I mentioned the Bank of Ireland, and Petra mentioned the thing about emails. Now, look, I'm the worst. I've just about got to the stage now where I switch my phone on when I go to bed, but I don't expect everybody to be like me. That's the first thing I'd say. But also, she was saying, this does mean our managers are saying to clients, they cannot expect our staff to be on call 24 hours a day. And that has to be made clear to them up front. Now, once that happens in companies like that starts cultural change. And I think, the thing about cultural change is it does take time, but then once you get companies like the Bank of Ireland doing that, and then other banks get to hear about it, then that's how this change comes. I mean, I think I was part of the BBC. I did a talk on that Open Up thing with the BBC staff, and that was what was really interesting to me about that. There's the BBC that, you know, gets lambasted for being woke and all this nonsense. But actually, what was really interesting to me was that as an employer and as an organization and as a workforce, I felt a real sense of they just didn't quite know what to do. They didn't. The management didn't. They were. And I don't know if you agree with this, Laura, but I felt that the management kind of were saying to the staff, look, we're struggling a bit with this. We need your help in how we frame our response. Now, I think that is quite a good position for an employer to be.
I mean, I can't have a bad word to like, I mean, yeah, we got things wrong and we always get things wrong. But as a company that supported me, if I was in the city, I'd have been thrown out. I would not have had a job. I remember a time it was the Westminster attacks. And I could hear, Alistair, the newsroom is mental, goes mental. And I was like, I know they're going to ask me to go because there was a short number of producers. And I was off. They came around, I could hear the footsteps and I was having more of a panic. I was like, I can't go. I just can't do it today. And I thought, but if I don't go, they're never going to ask me again. And I was like, and then my friend was like, it's all right, I'll go for you. I was like, no, I have to. Anyway, I couldn't go. But did they ask me to do it again? Yeah, I covered the royal wedding. And, I wasn't, they just understood. But it was because my particular team, and I can't speak for everyone, the BBC is a massive place, but people always say you stay there because of the people. And you do. And I think it was a really, they asked us, they wanted to learn. And it was for me personally, but I know other people would probably share a different story.
That's really, when I had my breakdown in the 80s, my very, very, very first, and part of my thing had involved, it's a long story, but it involved Heathrow Airport, and there was also a terrorist element to it. Okay. Anyway, the first job I got sent on when I went back was a terrorist incident at the Heathrow Airport. And I had exactly the same thing. I just could not face it. And I went to a phone box and I phoned, sadly he's dead now, but a very good colleague and friend of mine, Sid Young, down in Bristol. And I told him what was going on. I said, look, I'm covering this story. I can't do it. I cannot go to that airport. I can't do it. And he did it on the phone from Bristol and filed it in my name and the whole lot. Now, and eventually I told everybody that. And as with you, I did get offered other stuff afterwards as well. So it's just it's having those networks that counts. But I wasn't criticising the BBC, by the way. I actually felt.
Oh no, you weren't. No. I don't work for them anymore. It's fine.
Okay. No, I felt they were admitting this is an area that we know we have to do better and we want to know how.
Yeah.
That integration, isn't it? Is the awareness that when we go to work, we bring our whole person there, regardless of how well we might seem to leave a personal life at the door. It's there, and it cannot not impact who we are at work. And I think, in fact, the more pressure we feel to leave that half of us, or that a good chunk of us at the door, the more pressure we're putting on ourselves, and often then exacerbating some of the mental health challenges that we're experiencing. And it's, I think it seems what you're saying is that there needs to be that education on how to integrate, because we tend to fear what we don't understand. So that fear is coming from that, almost that lack of education of what is trauma, what is, of course, if you've been in that situation, traumatic situation, replacing you in that situation is going to be traumatic. And it's that, I think it's the respect, developing a respect of the wholeness of a person, rather than, longer the days now where our computers are at work, we switch them off and we go home. That is not how the world works anymore. And it thrives in many ways for those blurred boundaries, but our mental health is suffering. So I think
I also think there isn't you don't have to be at such a huge extreme. You don't have to be hospitalized or whatever, and when I talk, I don't really talk about my eating disorder as much, because that was just my vehicle. The reasons why I did it were probably fundamentally the same as why lots of people have things: grief or not getting my needs met. And so I think it's about fundamentally we all are the same humans, and many of the reasons why we we struggle or we find an alternative way to help us escape of the same. So if we take more time to learn, be more compassionate around humans as a whole, I think that especially in the workplace, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, there's a thread that runs through all of your stories, really, isn't it? And it's that compassion. It's someone had compassion, someone saw beyond, someone took a moment to acknowledge the wholeness of who you are, and invite you not just to have to just keep tucking a massive part of you away. So it's that thread of compassion and acknowledgement, and not putting you in a box, and those are the catalysts for change within those working environments. So any more thoughts before we close? Any more things that you'd love to share as a closing note?
Can I jump in on a couple of the questions that there's one from David Orford I see there. What do you think about portrayals of mental health in the media? And I do think this is an area where the media has a responsibility that goes beyond just their usual kind of responsibilities. And I think on this, the media has been pretty good. Interestingly, some of the best stuff we did with Time to Change was working with the soap operas when they were portraying people with schizophrenia or OCD or anxiety, panic attacks, whatever it might be. And it was extraordinary the length they went to try to kind of, make sure they got it right. And but I think it's a place where I think some of the portrayals are terrible, but I think actually, if I think how much I think of our media generally, which is not a lot, on mental health, I think they're doing a lot better.
There's a lot of awareness building, which I think is really on point. And like you said, in some of the soap operas, but if we just think of the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial and how mental health is thrown around in that as a sort of, and we're like right at the close just to open all that idea. But, I think it's really being portrayed to younger audiences as a shame-fueled experience that is violent, that is drug-induced. And, if this is the picture that we have of mental health and how it can be used against you in this sort of way in celebrity culture, I actually think it's not doing many favors, as well as to agreeing with your point for sure.
I think I agree. Oh, sorry, Karen.
No, go on.
I think I was just going to share, as a journalist in the media, I think I was asked by a really well-known publication to do a feature, but what they asked for was, can I have the worst pictures of yourself? And I said, I'm not doing it. Like, no, that is not a great representation. Like, of course, there is an aesthetic element to my illness, but that's not the reasons why I developed it. I want to talk about everything else. And I think the media's responsibility, obviously it's clickbait, isn't it? So, the most shocking images or whatever, the most shocking story, bad news is always, the worst news, the ones that get the story. But I think as media and responsibility, we have a responsibility to share stories that aren't shocking. Because it's just not responsible at all. So yeah,
that story beyond, isn't it? It's that acknowledgement and that respect for the story beyond that which we first see and we might hone in on. And I think that's another thing that I've really taken from everything you've been saying is that importance of asking twice, are you okay? And it can just be that simple, as Petra was saying. Sometimes it is just the simple things. It's not having to do loads of training and becoming counselors. It's just the first, how are you? That can be quite perfunctory. It can be a bit tick boxy. Anyone can say that walking down the street, but that second one, that that often comes from a place of more compassion and care. So yes, that's just one thing that I've really taken from that. Just go beyond. So thank you so much, just to close, to our speakers, Petra, Laura and Alastair, for such engaging, insightful, valuable and illuminating words on mental health and well-being this afternoon. There are some really stark statistics out there that we cannot and absolutely should not ignore. 1 in 4 people, although Alastair rightfully challenged that, and I completely agree with him, experience a mental health problem of some kind each year. And I'm definitely one of those, as are we. And we are 4 in 4. 16% of people report experiencing a common mental health problem during any given week. And half of all mental health problems have been established within us by age 14, those formative young years. Depression is one of the leading causes of mental health problems, affecting 264 million people the world over. Our speakers today have offered some incredible tools and insight that you can hopefully put into good use as we re-establish and reimagine ways of working and connecting with one another. And as we look out for colleagues and friends and people in our families and communities. The Speakers Corner team will have a highlights reel of today's event for you to rewatch at your leisure and to share within your own networks. If you would like any information of any of the speakers you've heard from today, please contact one of the Speakers Corner team. I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts, the first given to us by the wonderful A.A. Milne by Christopher Robin, the philosopher Christopher Robin. Always remember, you're braver than you believe, you're stronger than you seem, and you're smarter than you think. And as the great Leonard Cohen reminds us, there is a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in. So thank you so much for joining us and have a great afternoon.